In this video, we're going to review information about using and writing functions. First, let's think about using a function written by someone else. Sometimes you'll be reading a problem description and it will tell you that or ask you how you would call a function that's in the standard library or that somebody else wrote using various information. So in that case, you don't have to write the function implementation yourself. You just have to indicate how you would use it in your own program. The first question you have to ask when you're considering how you would call a function is, where is that function located? If the function's not part of the standard Python library, then your first step is to import the function, and you do that using the from syntax, where you say from, and then the name of the file, and then you say import, and then the name of the function. If the function is part of the standard library, then you can skip this step. It's automatically imported whenever you compile your Python program. Once you have access to the library by importing it, then we need to ask ourselves some questions about how we can communicate with the function. Remember that we can think of the function as a black box where it accepts input from outside the function, carries out an algorithm inside the black box, and then sometimes returns information from the function back to you, and that's called the return value. So the first question you have to ask yourself is whether there's any information that the function expects to receive as an argument from the main program. So it's information that would be coming from outside the function. The second question you have to ask yourself is whether the function returns a value back to the main program. It usually does this if the function's making a calculation. If the function's just displaying information, it might not return a value. So how would you find out this information about the arguments and the return value? Well, it's provided to you when you're given the problem description. So either the problem statement written by me or somebody else, or the Python documentation that's provided for you. Those would be places that you would read to decide whether there's an argument that's needed or arguments that are needed, and what the return value back is from the function. Once you have that information, you're ready to launch the function into action. We call that the function call. That means that you indicate that you want to execute that function's algorithm at this particular moment in your program. And you do that by including the function's name and also passing the expected information into the function and possibly returning or storing a value that's returned from the function. Right here, I've given you a few example function calls using different kinds of scenarios. So for arguments and return values. So if the function takes 2 arguments and has a return value, the function call would look like this, where you have the function name and then both argument values inside the parenthesis. And then because it has a return value, one is set that something equal to the result of that function. That's where you're storing the return value. If a function takes no arguments and has a return value, the call would look something like this. Note that the argument list here is empty because there are no arguments expected. You're still storing the return value, the information that comes back from the function. Sometimes the function's set up so it doesn't have a return value. In those cases, you don't say result equals or something over here to the left. You just put the name of the function and then the arguments. If the function doesn't take any arguments, then of course leave that blank. If the function does take arguments, then you list those inside the parentheses. So those are some examples of what a function call would look like if you're reading through a problem description and it asks you to make a function call. It's asking you to write a single line of code that looks something like one of these examples. On the other hand, sometimes when you're reading a problem description, it asks you to write a function to provide an implementation for it. In those cases, it wants you to create the function from scratch. It's not providing the function for you in the standard library or some other file. If you need to write the function, you have to think about the 2 separate parts, the implementation, where you write the algorithm for the function, and then the separate step where you write the main program that launches the function into action. If you think about the princess and the monster story, it's like you're writing both the princess's algorithm and also writing the monster room. Whenever you're writing a function implementation, your first step is usually to write the function itself. So you have to think about what work will be done by the function that you're creating. Just like when you're calling a function, you have to think about whether there's going to be information that's expected to come from outside the function. Those pieces of information will be parameters in your function's algorithm. And you also have to think about whether your algorithm is going to return information back to the main program. If it does, then your function is going to have a return value. If your function doesn't need to return any information back, then it won't have a return value. And either of those is valid as a possible way of writing your function. You just have to plan according to the problem statement that you're providing. Whenever you're writing a function implementation, your function definition follows a standard format, and I think of it kind of like a sandwich, where there's a definition line at the top, there's a return value at the bottom, and then the algorithm goes inside. So it's like you have a piece of bread at the top that's kind of standardized, piece of bread on the bottom, it's kind of standardized, and then the part that varies is the part that's in the middle. A function definition always takes this format where you have the definition and then a function name at the top, and then you list all of your parameter placeholder names, the colon after them. The last line of your function implementation always says return. If you're returning a particular data value because your function has a return type, then you would say return and then the variable name that represents your return value. If your function doesn't have a return value, then it'll look really similar. The top part stays the same, but your return statement just says return, meaning you're done with the function body, but there's no value here to return. Either way, regardless of whether you return a value or not, you put all your instructions for the function body inside the function, and don't forget to indent the body of the function. That helps Python to know that all of these statements are related to this function definition. So steps 1 and 2, those are required to write the function implementation. That's like creating the monster room, the potential to solve a problem. And then your final step is to write the main program that calls the function into action, possibly passing expected information into the function and storing a return value. Calling a function that you've written yourself looks exactly like calling a function in the standard library or a non-standard library. So you put in your function name, whatever you chose for your function, and then list any arguments you have, any information that you need to pass in, and then store the return value if you have one, and a variable that can be used in your program. If you don't need to store a return value, you can skip the step where you say result equals and just include your function name and arguments. That was a quick review of how to solve problems where the problem statement might ask you to call a function or to write a function yourself. And that's what we'll be practicing today in your assignment.